when we present, sometimes people say, well, you didn't give enough evidence, and sometimes people say your proposals weren't radical enough. There are all sorts of, ways in which we can't really do everything. And so yesterday I didn't really give any evidence at all. And my work is largely, I mean, now it's more organizational, but at one point from 2002 onward, it's been about collecting evidence. And my God, we've collected just tons and tons. In 2006, the paper Landslide Denied was basically irrefutable statistical evidence. I'm Jonathan Simon, Executive Director of Election Defense Alliance. Started in around 2002 after an election, off-year election in which the exit polls were shut down. They were shut down because they were so at odds with the vote totals, and then if you remember Max Cleland and Chuck Hagel, and there were a bunch of bizarre results. Well, the pattern we see, people could look at this and say, well, exit polls can be off and all this kind of stuff. There's ways of validating them, and they're not off. And the direction, we're nonpartisan as an organization, but the direction of, the direction of the shift, we call it the red shift, like the Doppler shift in astronomy, because it's always in the same direction, always. Election after election, year after year, race after race. When the races are competitive, you get this red shift. When they're not competitive, you get either no shift or much less of a red shift. That's targeting. That's pathognomonic of rigging. That's telling you that if something's happening with competitive races, it's not being done to non-competitive races. It's very hard to rig blowout races because your risk is very high for the reward, so it doesn't really pay, and you don't need 435 House seats to take power in this country, or 100 Senate seats. So I just want to draw attention to one thing, and I hope I'll have a chance. I don't know, I'm not formally part of the strategy pattern, but I'm going to leave the strategy out and hope that maybe I'll be welcome to say some things on the strategy part of the session, which is mainly what I concentrated on yesterday. But I just want to draw attention to a couple of elections, 2006, 2008, 2010, because that's our ramp up to where we are now and what we're looking forward to in 2012, 2014, 2016. And this involves numbers, and I'm always very worried about throwing any numbers out because they just kind of float there. But the 2010 election, I mean, it's universally interpreted. Articles one after another, all the pundits, all the articles, a huge sweep for not just the Republicans, but for the Republican right. The Tea Party was effectively baptized and moved into a position of commanding power, so far outside their membership. But rumor has it the Tea Party actual membership is 150,000. I mean, that's like a local chapter of the Knights of Columbus or something. So I mean, this, and they have all this power. Look what they just did, for God's sakes. This is insane. So we're looking at a couple of elections, and the 2006 election, which was a victory for the Democrats, should have been a much, much greater victory. There were about 3 million votes total in the House of Representatives stolen, shifted, net. That's a lot in House races. That was the equivalent of 20 to 25 additional seats. Huge difference. But in that election, the Democrats basically gained a net of 60 seats. I'm going to round off some numbers here, 60 seats. And they did it with a vote margin across the country of over 8%. So they won nationally by a margin of more than 8%, and they gained 60 seats. In 2010, this huge Republican sweep, the Republicans actually won nationally by less than 7%, 6.9%, so less, and they gained 128 seats.
By less than what percent? Can you repeat?
Less than 7%. Yeah, they won by 6.9%, and they gained 128 seats. This was a rout that we haven't seen in modern times. I'm not sure we've seen it ever. 2010. And it's what set up this Obama walking around like a whipped cur and this country skidding off the rails. 2010 election. And you ask, how is that possible? Well, 2/3 of the Republican House members now that are driving the policy of this country won with less than 55% of the vote. And when you say 2/3 won, you know how many safe seats there are in the House, right? So the other third were coming from gerrymandered districts where it's all Republican or all Democrat. So basically every competitive Republican race was won by a margin of less than 10%. And Republicans got less than 55%. And they won all of them. I mean, if you look at the histogram, you know, all these close races practically. So, you know, this is a pattern that is just so not compatible with statistics or norms or anything like that. Again, it's rigging central. And, you know, I guess the key point of our speaking to you, I mean, we're not going to change the world within this room. It's who you talk to and who they talk to and who they talk to. You got to go out and ruin their day, because this does ruin people's days. You know, they don't want to hear this. It's very, very far below the comfort zone. It's right in the groin, and they don't want to hear it. And there's a never happened here wall of denial. The media keeps it propped up thousands of feet high. Very hard to get past. But individuals in America are much, much more receptive to this than the power brokers, than the people who have seats in this hierarchy that we've built. So you can talk to people in Starbucks or Walgreens or wherever, and the odds are that if you say the right thing that's simple and basic and gets the point across, you will get somebody thinking about this and get them, be sure to tell them to get somebody else to be thinking about it. One other thing you can say, two other things, I'm probably out of time. I know yesterday my 15 minutes went
3 minutes.
Okay. One other thing to ask them, you know, people feel safe when they vote on paper. Well, yeah, I filled it in. Wrote it on paper. We vote on paper here. You know, it's not a DRE, we're okay. All right, whoever looks at that paper, in the absence of recount, nobody, ever. And how often do you have a recount? And when you do have a recount, Prosser, Kloppenberg, open ballot bags, broken seals, mismatched seals. If there's an incentive of X to rig an election, there's an incentive of 1,000X to cover it up afterwards. Because the last thing you want to do, it's always about risk-reward. You got to keep the risk low and the reward high. So once there's a focus, once they let that, there was a huge Democratic turnout, caught them with their pants down. All of a sudden there was a recount. It's like, oh shit. And send in the special ops or do whatever you have to do to substitute those things. So in precisely the places where we forecasted, where we saw smelly numbers, Milwaukee City, some of the places around Milwaukee City, Waukesha, the observers who watched the recount, it was all these wide open ballot bags. Not all of them, but enough that you could substitute wholesale all the ballots you needed to make it match the machine total. So ask people, when you vote on an optical scanner, how do you know? Let's say the vendors or somebody with access to the vendors, or in the case of modem machines, it could be the Chinese, it could be the Iranians, it could be me. How do you know they haven't offset the zero counters on the memory cards to +50 and -50 or +32 and -32? At the end of the day, you got the right number of votes, the clerk is happy, and you've just stolen 100 votes, or 64 votes, or however many votes you want to steal. Completely concealed. What we wind up finding are the numbers, the forensic numbers, and it's getting harder and harder for a bunch of reasons, which I don't have time to go into, but we may be on questions. We can. Our baselines are being taken away. So it's getting harder and harder to forensically detect election theft, and easier to carry it out. This is a serious, scary situation. It has, as Victoria said, I mean, any progressive who is not understanding that this comes before where you're headed issue-wise. You've got to have this, sine qua non. Without this, you lose. And right now you're losing, and you're going to continue to lose. And so this should be in the plenary. This should be absolutely #1 issue. And of course, everybody says that about their issue, whether it's saving the whales or whatever. But I mean, judge for yourself. How do you win if you can't win elections? And if they have the thumb on the scale in cyberspace and nobody knows about it. Okay.
How did you do that? Hi everybody, I'm Sheila Parks and I'm the founder of the Center for Hand-Counted Paper Ballots. And we are against the DREs, direct response recording electronic voting machines, against the touchscreens, against the op scams, not a typo. My good friend and colleague, Sheila Parks, coined that term about the op scans. They all rigged. We need to count them right the first time on election night by hand. That is my major message. And I will also be radical enough, Jonathan knows that. But a quick little history of, you know, Kerry and Gore both won the elections, and yet Gore went to the White House. And although I totally agree with everything that Jonathan and Victoria said, for me the Democrats have to be complicit. Why are they allowing this to happen? Why did in Massachusetts Coakley not protest when Brown won, when she had gazillions of us calling her up, including, I'm sure, Jonathan and me, saying, don't concede, don't concede. The same with Kerry and Gore. We said, don't concede, don't concede. And yet both of them conceded. And with Kerry and Gore, they asked all their colleagues in the Senate not to protest their concession. What is that about? What is that about? That has got to be investigated. In Florida in 2000, there was that famous scene, I think in Dade County, with all of these people, they were men people, in the room, and it went on all over national television, saying, stop the recount, stop the recount, stop the recount. Do any of you remember seeing that? Okay, so then Rachel Maddow has this great clip on her show, and you can see it. I left a card for everybody to send to the hand-counted paper ballot. We have a clip of this. So she has the name on each of those protesters in that room saying, stop the recount, and they were all, every single one of them, Republican operatives, and their name is on their faces there, in that room saying, stop the recount, and that's when they stopped the recount. It's called the Brooks Brothers Rebellion, and that's how they're all dressed. Now go to 2002, Jonathan mentioned that. Here we have Max Cleland, incumbent, Democrat liberal, paraplegic veteran from the war, Saxy Chambliss, right-wing Republican, and there is a difference on some of the Republicans. Chambliss wins in an upset victory this 2002 election. That's bad enough. Then fast forward to 2011, it turns out that Saxy Chambliss is part of the Gang of Six that is calling for the end of Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid, while a Democrat is president. Who would ever have believed that would happen? So those tentacles of these rigged elections, here they are in 2011, you know, showing up their dirty, ugly, rigged faces. 2004, there's only one senator in the whole place, Barbara Boxer, that's willing to say, I don't want to, you know, certify the Ohio votes. Wow. Where were the rest of them? Where were the rest of those people? And, you know, what was the concession about? And talk about conspiracy theorists. Her name is, tell me the name of the woman who, you know, got killed. That's what I want to go to. The Ohio rep.
Stephanie Tubbs.
Stephanie Jones Tubbs, who is the, you know, the representative who says, I'm not going to certify the votes. She gets murdered very soon. She was one of the most, well, she died of a thing. Okay. But Lynn Landis keeps on sending me, and I have somewhere, you know, some kind of thing that she could have been murdered. That's a big could have. But it was, you know, she was one of the most radical Democrats in the House, and suddenly she's gone too. In Florida, they had Catherine Harris to do the rigging, make sure it all happened. In Ohio, they had Kenneth Blackwell. I don't know who they have in Wisconsin. I don't know who's doing it, but I do think they have to have a major person doing it, making sure this rigging happens, allowing it to happen. And I don't think Scott Walker was elected. I don't think the country is right-wing enough to have elected the 7 ultra-right-wing governors that got elected all at one time, And I think that because Wisconsin has been, I mean, people tell me it's a swing state, but, you know, Rachel Maddow, again, and although I'm not a fan totally anymore, because she has never picked up this subject. And once again, we have all flooded her with things to pick it up. But, you know, the union was founded here, all of the unions, everything. So it's a perfect state to have you fail at everything now and to become just the opposite of what Wisconsin is all about. And I do believe it's a model for the entire country, just a takeover state by state by state, to have the right-wing junta, the push, the junta, you know, the coup is happening really here in Wisconsin. What are you going to do about it? Okay, one thing on the recall Walker thing, which I can't imagine it not being rigged. I mean, why would they give that up? So the Center for Hand-Counted Paper Ballots put out a call for somebody maybe somebody in this room, maybe somebody you're going to talk to, as Jonathan said, all the people you're going to talk to put out an injunction you have to go to court to file an injunction to impound all the electronic voting machines, including all the memory cards, including all the ballots, immediately the second the polls close on election night for those recalls, because otherwise the chain of security is just gone and just forget the whole thing. Now, Corwin, a Republican, did this in New York, 26, when they were fighting for the seat that had been Republican for centuries, and Paul Ryan did lose because of the Medicare stuff there, so the Democrats actually got that seat. But you know, the Republicans play hardball. I don't know what the Dems are doing. And you know, and you're speaking to a lifelong Democrat, so it's not as though I don't like them. Well, not anymore. But so I don't know who would be, you know, it would be good if a lawyer filed that, but any citizen can file it as far as I know. And, you know, once again, if Wisconsin Wave picked up that letter that I wrote, an open letter to that, you can find it. You can find it on our site. You can find it all over the internet, this injunction that somebody has to file. And now you have time. You have time to approach people. You have time to approach national organizations. WEAC, W-E-A-C, is that how you pronounce it? I mean, I would approach them, somebody, because they, on either September 20th or 21st, are calling for it. There's going to be a day sick out. All the teachers are going to be sick, and I'm hoping, praying, intending that all the other unions will follow them. They would be a good one to, you know, to do this injunction if you can. Jim Miller, who's sitting right here, Jim, I'm going to quote you, thinks it needs a big, strong organization to do this with a lot of money. I don't know that he's right or not, but if he is right, line up some organizations that you think might do it. If he's not right, just play it from all sides. Don't, you know, play it from all sides. Ask little people on the street. Ask the bravest, most revolutionary person you know in the world if they would file this injunction. And also, and I would, if I lived in Wisconsin, believe me, I would file it. But also ask, you know, the organizations and give them the data. Jonathan's presented a lot of data on our site. We have all the data of all the computer geeks, professor students, including the famous Harry Hersey hack that have hacked all of these machines. It's there to watch. It's just there to watch. It's in, you know, hidden in plain view, to borrow a saying from the Underground Railroad and Harriet Tubman. So the hand-counted paper ballots, immediately when the election closed, and on this handout that I have, there's a place in Acton, Maine could be a model for the entire country. In 4 hours, 6 teams of 2 people each, a Republican and a Democrat, make sure you have the people on ballot, counted 944 ballots 2 times by hand. They had 7 races of, you know, candidates, and they had 2 initiatives, so they had 11 items on the ballot. I think this country can wait 4 hours to get a hand-counted paper ballot count twice.
Where did that happen?
In Acton, Maine, and there's a link to the article here, and I printed out what I read. I observed that election. I was there watching the hand count. That's the other thing I think you should do. Go and watch some hand count elections so that when you talk to people, you can say, I was there, I saw one, I know how easy it is to do. You know, anybody can go observe this. I called them up and I would say, I'm an ardent hand-counted paper ballot advocate. Can I come and watch you hand count? They said, please come. No one said no to me. And I went all over New England. People were wonderful. The clerks and the assistant clerks were wonderful. So that you count the ballots immediately after the election closes, teams of opposing people on the ballot. Count them twice. The results are posted on the precinct level. Precincts should be like no more than 1,000 people. Polling places, municipalities, jurisdictions, whatever you call them in different states. Posted immediately at the precinct level so that they cannot ever be rigged. There they are to see. Videograph. Somebody's there with all these cameras videographing it. Live streamed on the internet. New people coming in to count the elections so that there's not the tired people who were there all day. There are disagreements among the activists, but I don't care how will you do it. Pay the people who count or don't pay them, but have them come in there. Make sure they come in there. So, and this is all laid out step by step right here. I have written several times on this. There's a long list here of what must be done to do this. And I have like 2 seconds left to say. The time might be over. We may have reached the tipping point. I am calling for civil disobedience, absolute nonviolent civil disobedience. Yesterday was the dedication of the Martin Luther King Memorial in Washington, D.C. He was a major, major nonviolent person. I took my name Parks after Rosa, and yesterday was the anniversary of the women getting the right to vote amendment passed. The time is very, very late, folks. I'm not sure how much we time. Be your bravest, 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 most revolutionary, radical self. Thank you.
Good question.
Jonathan, you mentioned security of the ballots, and that seems an obvious place where Wisconsin and maybe other places need improvement. So can you kind of describe how do you keep those ballots secure between election night and when a recount might occur? What's the overall picture? We need to get an injunction for every single election and bring it all to a central spot? What do you give us some details?
That's a good question. I mean, New York State actually bans recounts except under some very, very, very limited circumstances. And the reason they did that in their constitution is that they came to the conclusion that you could not secure a chain of custody, and the longer you waited after the ballots were cast, the more opportunity there was for ballot massage. And, you know, Wisconsin's a poster child for that at this point, because that recount, really the chain of custody was observed in the breach, and you saw all these bags that were unsealed and missealed. So I think that, you know, for the time being, while machine counts are happening, yes, you're right. I mean, to get a chain of custody, the ballots effectively have to be impounded. Otherwise, they're just too vulnerable. And, you know, that time interval that elapses until the recount is a very, very long one. And given the incentive to cover any rig, to prevent, because, you know, you rig a race, you win that race. You get exposed in rigging that race, you blow the cover off of rigging for the entire, potentially the entire country. You turn things around. So the incentive there is so incredibly high. And, you know, we know what special ops can do wherever they're coming from. They can get pretty much into any system or any storehouse, any warehouse. I mean, it's not hard. And there's plenty of funding to make that happen. So the ballots are not secure. Where we want to go ultimately is get the ballots counted before any of these opportunities come up, and get them counted by hand, getting that, you know, then posted, and there's a tree of reconciliation. It's a you know, in modern times with 300 million Americans, it's a bit of a, you know, awkward process. It's not the most superficially efficient process. There's, you know, we're very wedded to convenience, and that makes this realistically a hard sell. I mean, hand-counted paper ballots sound great from a position of principle, but you have to be able to get past the argument of, like, well, suppose it takes 2 days or blah, blah, blah. And, you know, so there's a real tremendous balance test, you know, between convenience and truth. And our country has gone the way of convenience now for several decades at least. We're paying the price. It's hard to get off the sauce, you know, intervention.
Could I add something? I know you asked Jonathan. My good friend and colleague Paul Lito says that you can only get an honest recount even in a state where the Secretary of State, in Wisconsin it's the GAB, I guess, where the Secretary of State is in the same party as the person wanting the recount. And two good examples of those are Al Franken in Minnesota, where I forget his name, but, you know, the Secretary of State was for that and was against. And years ago, not so many years ago, but back in 2003-04, in Washington, Gregua wanted a recount for governor, and the person there in the SOS was also a Democrat, and she won the recount for governor there, Gregor, G-R-E-G-O-I-R. And other than that, those have been the two recounts that have been honest and happen. I mean, look at your recount.
I just have to say something about that, because from a statistical standpoint, I don't think, and many of my colleagues don't think, that the recount in Minnesota was even remotely honest. We think what happened there was a spread of almost 10% in that race in the exit polls. We think that race was rigged up the wazoo. They came too close, so they had a recount. They stuffed like crazy into those ballot bags in Minnesota. Again, you can do it, and my point here is that even with a friendly Secretary of State, these things can be done. At the end, they basically our belief has allowed Franken to win because they wanted him to take his seat and shut up and not, if Coleman had won, there would have been further legal proceedings because Franken gave no sign of going quietly. So they basically said, okay, you win, we'll take the seat back with Scott Brown in Massachusetts, and they did. So just a gloss there.
And are the recounts honest here in Wisconsin, like between Kloppenburg and Prosser? I was wondering if that was honest or not. Is what I'm questioning there, because Milwaukee County Clerk Kathleen Nicholas was the one, she claimed that she found some missing votes, and do you think that when she said that she really found missing votes, or was she just making it up and rigging it?
I think it was totally rigged. And Kathy Nicholas had her hand in the recount too. So it was rigged, All those ballot books, go ahead, Jim, you talk.
Actually, I think the recount was accurate.
Perfect.
They stole the election before that, and what was there, they counted accurately, but what was there probably wasn't what was voted. And so, but yeah, there were massive problems, and Darcy.
Mary Magnuson is sitting here. She took pictures of those things.
I got it on my
She took pictures of these, the ballot bags with all the holes in them, so you could stuff things in and out of those ballot bags. They were all over the internet. It's hard for me to believe that they weren't viewed by the GAB and by Kathy Nicholas. They didn't care. They just did it anyhow, because what we gonna do after they lost the recount? Get the injunction.
While you were talking about the injunction, we've discussed this a bit and how difficult it is and kind of precedent-setting Wisconsin it would be. But I'm thinking how we interact with what we've been trying to do, which is get a hand count. If you can't get a hand count, then at least get a display of the ballots so that we can videotape them, check them. And if you can't get that, or a post-election test, or an audit before the things are certified, then certainly have an exit polling situation like EDA was doing. But I'm thinking what we do now is declare that for the next statewide election that we're moving towards impoundment. And what we do is announce that in advance, and we announce that to every ward, telling every clerk and every election official that we're building a case why their ward might be impounded. Now, the way they avoid impoundment is hand count. And if they're going to hand count, we leave them off the list of impoundment. So,
That's a great idea.
Why aren't you going to do it for the
We
recall?
should talk about that during our strategy, right?
Jim, that's fabulous. Why aren't you going to do it for the recount of, the recall of Scott Walker?
that would be the next major.
That's the next
election.
Oh, thank you.
That's it.
I actually have a question going back to anybody familiar with Wisconsin. Is that recall election likely or certain to be a single race election, or are they going to shove it on the ballot with other things?
Probably
It'll be on the
That's what
ballot.
they're saying they're trying.
That's the issue right now.
Okay.
I would like to see it be a separate incident so we can isolate it.
If it is a single race election, you have a much better chance of getting them to hand count as well.
Okay, that's a good
So
argument
that's
we'll make.
important.
Because right now they're talking about spring, April of 2012 or November of 2012.
Yeah.
And I think we should force it to a single election.
Absolutely.
That forced that issue.
Thank you.
They're talking about the head of the Democratic Party wants to do that, but the grassroots organization, most of us being independents, are going to make sure it's not. It is going to take place in this November. They're going to start the recount.
Yes, we are.
And they've already got plenty of names that they just have to get again in November.
But how does that translate to when it would be put on the ballot? I mean, even if you start February, okay.
Well,
isn't
that
when
they're going to do a Republican primary?
No,
But that's
what
There will be
concerned about.
Republican primaries, and that's the argument that Mike has.
That would not be.
So they can't,
But most of them, I understand that most of the Democratic chairmen in the state are against that. They want to have it now. They want to have it in February. That's where I got it.
It won't happen.
Most of the Democratic chairmen, I'm sorry.
County chairman
Oh, the
are
county.
against, they want to have it in February. Mike Tate wants to have it
Yeah, well,
with the next
I don't know if
election.
he's gonna be.
I
good
don't
like
expect
that
it'll
much longer.
happen in February, because once you file, then what I expect will happen is there'll be challenges to that, court
Yes,
challenges,
a lot.
massive numbers, it'll put it back. the Republicans are gonna aim for the April spring election.
Right.
And then what the left needs to do then is have a primary.
Hmm.
Throw somebody up, you only need a couple thousand signatures. You have a primary and you push it out of the April election, because April election is when conservatives come out.
Right.
And this year, next year is going to be also the Republican primary for president. Now, they're likely to have decided a bit by that time, but it's still a dangerous event. So to get near that time period, what you need to do is throw up a primary for the Democrat, move it back off of the April election, have a separate ballot only for Scott Walker.
I'm nominating Jim Miller for taking over Mike Tate's job today.
I have a question. When we talk about potentially impounding, what are we basing it on? Based on what? Don't we have to have a basis for it?
I didn't hear the first
basis-
part of the question.
The way I see it is we write up in advance documents saying, this particular ward uses this particular machine. Here are the studies from Princeton and University of California, Santa Barbara. And here's the law that says that they're not going to hand count these. And you do those studies, you put them all in advance, and you leak it out there too, so the judiciary has a chance to start absorbing this. So that when you show up just before the election, ask for impoundment, it's not like, well, that's too overwhelming, we're not going to do anything with it. So this has to, I think, to do the impoundment, we've got to have a long effort leading up to that. And it can be, as I said before, integrated with what we're trying to do, just to get a hand count.
And more generally on that, Jim, I think it just brings me this idea of, action versus education, biding one's time versus rushing in. And there's a fair amount of tactical debate about that, and I think it'll be addressed in the strategy session. But, if you look at what the right wing did in this country, they formed think tanks back in Barry Goldwater's time, and after that, there was a lot of preparation, and ultimately they're rigging elections, so, that's not the model we want to follow, but there was a lot of educational preparation, there was a lot of introducing of ideas, introducing of memes, introducing of language. That's really, really important for the moment when you, let's say, take over an election precinct or something and disable the op scanner, do whatever it is that ultimately you might have to do if none of this other more cooperative work bears fruit. But if you do that nakedly, if you do that tomorrow, or if we had done that in August, people would be up in arms. First of all, the media will have a field day. They basically want to kill us anyway. So, we're not going to count on any wonderfully supportive, understanding press or communication. So you're basically, then written off as hostile lunatics, probably terrorists, as a matter of fact. So there has to be an environment, really, that supports that type of, okay, now we finally had enough of storming the Bastille kind of action, whether it's, completely nonviolent, whether there's, any sort of jostling going on, anything where you're interfering with this sacrosanct process has to be really supported by the kind of things that Jim is talking about, and communicating with the clerks and the courts and the media and all your fellow citizens.
The nice thing that came out of the recount, thank Kloppenberg, whenever I see her for doing that much of it, I wish she'd taken it farther, but what we found out is that, there were a few thousand votes that weren't properly counted even for what was there, because of the way they were marked in optical scans. So we know that the machines are not perfect. And so what we're trying, okay, when they're not great, because Diebold makes all the ATM machines, and they process billions of dollars every day with very few mistakes. So these machines are capable of very high quality work when they're not great. But the optical scan machines have missed a couple thousand votes in that election. So we know there's problems. So that's our justification for us. Let's give her a hand count. I now have email back from Michael Haas, who's the attorney at the GAB. I asked him about, okay, the ballots get put through an optical scan machine. All right, now we want to verify that. Can the election workers count those ballots by hand and compare the totals? They've taken the position that that's not authorized, and it's potentially a felony for an election worker to count ballots.
Really?
Yes. Now, when we go public with this, say machines are wrong and can be rigged, and they're not allowing people to count the ballots. Whoa, everybody, there's something wrong here. I mean, now they start to make the connection that our system has been undermined by the ALEC, basically. They've been putting through legislation to undermine our ability to see and have a fair and open count of the ballots. So, that's how we'll use this information and work towards delegitimizing the machines and how they're hiding the count. And that will all go into, things written up in advance and laid out there so they know it's coming. Here's the impoundment is coming. The machines are riggable. We're not allowed to count the votes. We know that even if they're not rigged, they make mistakes. And I think pull it all together like that and just say, here we come. We're coming with the impoundment. You don't want to have your ballots impound. Show us that you're honest. Can't count them.
Let's start in Butler. Just kidding.
Okay, that's fine.
Reverse question? Oh, go ahead.
Jim, I would say include this, when you read it more carefully, include this action make thing. Say, here it is, they did it. Why can't you do it? This kind of town does.
Oh, yeah.
And the clerk of that town is wonderful. Maybe she'll come down and work with you, do stuff like that. I wanted to work with her. And here's how to do it. So whatever they're doing, they're saying, this Mike Tate, and I've spoken with him, Mike Cass, I've spoken with him too. So, we're handing to them how to do it. They don't even have to.
Yeah. My mother worked over 16 years and they hand counted all the time. But I noticed in the recount, and when you look at the advice in the GAB documents about how to hand count, they've got people reading off the ballots and somebody watching them to make sure they read the right one, and then 2 people doing hash marks. Well, in the recounts, what we found is, you have one person just sorting them into piles quickly with another person watching, and then you quickly count the stacks. It goes a lot faster than the call out the names and tally type thing. So the GAB right now is suggesting a slow, inefficient method, which further, takes away the incentive of clerks to do these hand counts.
And when you do the count like that, the hand count like that, and the hash marks and the so-called read and tally or read and mark protocol, you have a written record of the hand count. It's right there, in writing of how they counted those ballots. You can see that with your own eyes.
People who don't know, Kevin Kennedy just came in. He is the executive
Oh, Captain
director
Kennedy, you missed this. You
of
can
our-
watch it. You taped it all.
Government Accountability Board.
Kevin.
So-
Jim, reverse question, and then maybe you can throw it to Kevin if you don't know the answer. Are they going to? You said something about in Mike's response. Am I okay with addressing that?
Yes.
Okay. That there is a possibility, at least, that hand counting on the part of the clerks of previously machine counted ballots would be potentially a crime or something not permitted. And I'm trying to clarify, that's just in the case of machine counted ballots that have already been counted by machine. In other words, they're not going to take Sheila Padelko off to the slammer because she hand counted Lincoln County. Right?
No.
You can opt into hand counting.
Communities under 7,500 don't have to use machines, so they can hand count.
Okay.
But if they're using machine, then I believe this would apply where they wouldn't be able to hand count without violating the rules. But they can on their own decide they're not going to use the machines for this next election if they're under 7,500. If they're over 7,500, they have to send a request into Kevin to ask for permission to hand count the ballots.
What defines a community? Are we talking about a city, a town, a village?
Wisconsin has towns which are originally 6 by 6 mile areas. They have villages and cities. Those are the 3 entities that conduct the elections. And so a city, a village, or a town, 7,500 populations cut off.
I just want to end this now with, because it's 11 and we want to go into the other session and some people may want to leave, but I want, Jonathan and I have talked a lot here and Victoria needs to have some words on this question and answer.
I'm happy to listen. I mean, we're getting into the strategy session now, I guess, already, so. And this has to do with how things are working specifically in Wisconsin. My interest in getting involved, I've been working with Wisconsin election activists online for a couple of months, I guess, and my interest in doing that was because of the Wisconsin uprising. I was hopeful for the first time in a long time, to see people rising up. And, you know, my hope still is that that energy that is still here in Wisconsin can focus on the integrity of the election system and go down to the root of this issue, because none of you can feel confident right now that Scott Walker even won this election. Nobody can prove that he won the election, and nobody can prove that he didn't. So that's a real problem. And I think going forward, with any, you know, I come from a radical background. I come from a radical family. I have, you know, I'm genetically programmed for this. I can't help it. When I see a radical uprising, I'm like, you know, I have to come here from Mexico. And it's like, but what I'm hearing from people is, well, we rose up against the Scott Walker policies, but it's difficult to get people to look at the elections and have that same response. I think it is, but I think there's an inertia there, and there's a total lack of understanding of the situation. But if everybody in this room becomes a hub of information that is then shared, at some point we are gonna to start to shift that mass consciousness. And I don't know if the 100th monkey theory is really true, but it could be true. So at some point, you know, and it's happening. It's actually, I'm seeing it happen online as well. I mean, I troll through all the left-wing sites, and there is, you know, a lot of us have been writing about this for a long time, and I start to see now in the commentary section on articles about elections, people are starting to say, well, you know, maybe this analysis about the election isn't even accurate, because how do we even know who won this election? And I'm like, thank you, God. You know, finally people are looking at, you know, the man behind the curtain. And that's what we have to start talking about. So I'm hoping that as you guys go on with your activism work here, that you can make this a central point of discussion. And if there is more uprising and civil disobedience, that you consider how to relate that to the voting booth and your right to see your vote counted.
So we're going to end this section now, in case people want to leave. Are you going to stay?
I just want to ask one question. One of the biggest things that comes to me is, the complaint is if people really know this, they won't vote. And we hear this over and over again, particularly from the Democrats, that they're afraid that they can't get the vote out if they know about this. How do we handle
You
this?
absolutely, just you.
And by the way, I'm an independent who was mostly Republican until a few years ago, so I don't come from a radical background, I come from the other side. Just to let you know.
I just want to, I know Jim Miller is jumping out of the seat. I want to say one thing though. I used to have a boycott the vote perspective, but I do know it's harder for them to rig it when there's a tremendous turnout.
Right.
So,
Right.
and I think, so I've reversed my position on that. I think you have to flood on election day, you've got to flood it. It's
Right.
because then people can say, hey, I saw it. I saw lines of Democrats or even whoever, but it's got to be part of a larger movement. We need to tell people you can't trust the results, and we're moving toward the solution, and this is what the solution is. I mean, it's part of a whole movement.
In Wisconsin, you can take control of the situation. In Wisconsin, if you write in the name of the candidate, even if the candidate is on the line above the writing line, and you darken the oval, or you connect the arrow parts, it goes through the optical scan machine. The optical scan machine takes it into a separate bin. When they do the printout, it says there are 50 ballots in that bin. The rules from the GAB, number 3 under counting the vote, says that the poll workers, the election workers, take those out of that bin, and they write on their tally sheet the name of the person voted for, and they, you know, hand tally that. So you can assure a hand tally of your vote, and by just writing in people who are already on the ballot. So now what it also does then is if there's a malicious code in the optical scan machine that's flipping votes, if it's on a percentage basis, say every 20th vote gets flipped, by taking yours out of that stream and putting it into the write-in, you may be reduced in the number of votes that get flipped also. But you're assured that your vote is counted accurately, and if you write it in. Now, what that does also, it creates more work for election workers. They will not like that. But we've already asked them to hand count their votes, and they've already said, no, we're suggesting this only in those cases where they are not hand counting. And what we did was we suggested that there be a golden ballot award that would be put to any particular ward that was going to hand count and ask them to post it. The GAB said, no, that's not authorized. The information should not be posted. But we will find a way to let people know which wards are actually going to hand count. And when they don't hand count, there's going to be a big push to be writing ballots. And we'll get the equivalent of the hand count, at least for the write-ins.
Could you just wait a minute until we shift to the other session, because I know you came into this. And does anybody want to leave? We're going to try, say again? This session, yeah. No, this is, we're going to try to do it, just hold on a second. We just want to make sure that everybody gets included in the talking of the strategizing session. And I know we're just going to say a few words about it. This is a way that we're going to try to proceed. About the Native American talking stick of people talking, so we pass it around as people talk. We're not sure it will work, but anyhow, this is a wand that we'll use for a talking stick to pass around. Maybe it will work, maybe it won't. We have an hour. Is anybody leaving? If you're not leaving, we can just plunge in. You want to start stuff?
I have a
I'll
question.
take it.
I have to grab this chair.
I have a question. Isn't it true that we have to have, according to the statutes, that there's got to be voting machines according to the statutes of 7,500 or more?
Yes.
Okay, so who's behind that law, and until we change that, we've got,
Kevin can talk better to that tonight.
No, but I'm just saying, I think that there's plenty of blame to go around if we have to have them. It's a matter of following the law, right?
Yeah, when I asked about the hand counting for totals that were already put through the machines, the first reaction from the election specialist I talked to is, well, what happens if there's a difference? It's kind of like, that would be terrible, refuting our machine total. And I said, well, that's the purpose of doing the hand count, to find these discrepancies, whether it's the individual who circled their oval instead of filling it in and didn't get recorded, or if it was actual malfunction or a malicious act.
So can we hand count then instead, because we don't like the machine?
So if you want to talk, could you hold on for a minute? If you want to talk, raise your hand. I'll stack you up like George did yesterday and hand you this. Here you are. And note that we would like everybody who wants to talk gets a chance to talk. And so.
I just have a very practical question. If you write in a candidate so that it'll be counted, and maybe mess up the machine count, so that it's more accurate. Do you also fill in the oval or fill in the arrow?
Yes.
You do both?
Yes.
Okay.
Now, further that, if somebody writes in the name of an individual but does not connect the oval or fill in the arrow, what happens is that ballot will go into the regular bin. And step 4 of the counting of ballots, after they've gone through step 3, which is to take out the writing, step 4 says they're supposed to go through every ballot in that bin looking for the additional write-ins that were imperfectly done. And we found in a number of locations they didn't do that. They were taking them out and just putting them in the bag. But what we're going to do is we'll have enough observers there, we'll be communicating with them enough in advance so that they know that there's going to be somebody watching them and asking them, in effect, to follow the guidelines on these things. So, and we'll probably even be talking to the GAB about that and suggesting that they remind all their election workers prior to elections about the guidelines.
Going to move to Consulting.
No one wants to talk? I would say a few things. I wanted to just say a few things also. Very brief. Kevin, listen up.
I'm here.
No, because, Jonathan had said about, like storming the barricades and civil disobedience. I am against that totally. I want to make sure that everybody hears that. I am totally against that. I am for nonviolent civil disobedience. And for people who don't know, I did a year in prison for nonviolent against nuclear, first strike nuclear weapons as the 13th plowshares. So I want you to know, I do walk my talk. But I have suggested that you sit in Kevin Kennedy's office and ask him where the laws came from, like the 7,500 law that any jurisdiction, municipality, I forget what you call them in Wisconsin, can only vote by electronic voting machine, and that 7,500 number comes from the census, not even registered voters. Sit in, they're sitting in Paul Ryan's office all over the country. All over Wisconsin and in Washington. So do some low-key, mild civil disobedience, sitting in people's offices until, they answer your questions. Do a vigil, get it out in the streets. It has to be out in the streets. Look at tar sands. I'm hoping that next year we have a hand-counted paper ballots against rigged elections, tar sands, at the Department of Justice, at the GAB in Wisconsin, whatever it is. But think creatively out of the box. That's it.
Are we at the official end of the last one or the beginning of the next one?
Yeah, we started just going
All
together.
right.
Everybody can talk.
Can I just, since I just got turned in to the local sheriff for storming the barricades, I just want to put a gloss on that, that there's a sequence of activity, and I think that's something that is always a matter of intense debate, whether it's Martin Luther King and Stokely Carmichael, Malcolm X, or whatever. There are people for whom the clock is approaching midnight, and there are people who still think it's 7:15, and I don't know the answer to that. My sense from all that I've worked on is that it's later than we think, and we're in very, very deep shit. And activists might have a tendency to agree with that. The person right now shopping at the farmer's market might think it's 7:15 or maybe 2 in the afternoon as opposed to midnight. So my feeling is, though, that at some point, our starting from vote scam on, our sense of the system as a whole, not picking on Wisconsin or any individuals, has been the system as a whole, concertedly and perhaps conspiratorially, has been tremendously unresponsive to these concerns and these issues, whether framed academically, numerically, forensically, politically, in any shape or form, legislatively. There has been lockdown, there has been shutdown. So if that persists to the point where you are, spinning your wheels and working through the fine points of, voting on an op scam and stuff, and elections are still coming out as bizarre as 2010, the numbers that I gave you for 2010, then I think the natural response, whether it's, Paul Revere, or I don't want to mischaracterize Paul Revere, that's been done this year already. But whether it's back in 1776 or it's in 2011, the next level is, all right, we have to make something happen. And that's at the point where, without necessarily injuring anybody or creating violence per se, one ratchets it up to a level where you can't just be told, yeah, we've got that paper, we'll take it under consideration, thank you very much, sit down, shut up. And that's where I was going with that. And there needs to be a lot of prior education and outreach before that type of strategy then becomes effective. And that's where probably the stage that we're at now.
I'd like to say too, just coming right off that point, when you start to look at the evidence, you're going to get angry. You may not get angry before you start looking at the evidence. It's an abstract concept, rigging elections. But when you start to look at the evidence and you see what people have gone through in this country to try to expose it, to try to bring it to you, and they've been railroaded completely. Railroaded, marginalized, ridiculed, imprisoned, and sometimes murdered. I mean, the last 2 whistleblowers were murdered. I never remember their names.
Mike and
Mike Connolly.
Okay. So I again just say it is a process of education and learning. For instance, learning how technology has been used to railroad democracy. It's technology has a lot of wonderful uses, and this is one of them. It can rig elections undetectably. And it's been a process, like even the old style machines that used to have the the counters on the back that would roll around like, you know, in a casino. The election officials used to look at those counters in the morning, and they would have zeros on them, and they'd write on the canvas sheet 0 and certify that. Then the next step of technology was to cover that up and bring in these print-o-matic devices. So this was even more efficient, they said. Bring in the print-o-matic devices, and it goes over those actual counters, and it was a piece of paper that would roll down past the counters, and the counters would imprint onto these print-o-matic devices. Well, they all jammed when they were first used, and when people pulled the paper out, all the paper was pre-printed. This is the kind of thing I'm talking about. Technology has a lot of uses, but you know, I tend to feel in some cases I don't see where it's beneficial. For instance, food. You know, I like my food grown organically in the ground and not genetically engineered and not sprayed with a lot of toxins. And I'm not interested in a lot of technological imprints on my food. And I feel that way about voting too. It's one of those things that more is not better. I just want to see the ballots counted. And every time they tell you, well, it's more efficient, or we just can't. Election officials, obviously not Mr. Kennedy, who's been nice enough to show up, but often they are absolutely arrogant, dismissive, totally rude to anybody who comes forward. Maybe not in Wisconsin, because you people are really nice here, but go to Miami, go to other places, and they get very intimidating. And people are intimidated by them when they say, hey, you know, I'd like to have my ballots counted. They're really dismissed as Luddites or conspiracy theorists. So there's more strength in numbers when you can start educating more people, and all of you have the courage of your convictions to, you know, approach the elections establishment and say, we're tired of technology taking over our vote count and taking it away from us. Yes.
I'm sort of new to this, so I have to ask. I'm clear there are countries that do hand count.
Yes. Who's still hand counting?
Well,
Okay.
countries, what has happened, it's not so much that they're hand counting countries. When we're talking about the major countries like Germany, Netherlands, Ireland, there are countries that have begun the return trip back towards hand counting. In other words, they were working with DREs,
Yes.
they abandoned the DREs, they insisted in Germany, for instance, that there be a paper record. It's not all the way. I mean, it's basically taken them to where we are with OPSCAs. I'm not sure how far they've gone in Ireland, I'm not far, and Holland.
Ireland is all hand counted.
All hand counted. So there are a couple of places. Canada is well, and again, part of it depends on what kind of governmental system you have. If you have a parliamentary system, you're going to see single ballot elections. Single ballot elections are more amenable to hand counting. They're just easier to hand count. One of the perennial arguments against hand counting in this country is, you know, look at Los Angeles County. You got 76 ballot props and offices and stuff. How are you ever going to count that? And so our EDA's position has long been, all right, well, let's just hand count the federal races. You only have 1, 2, or 3 federal races. Now that is a compromise. That's a significant compromise, because you're looking at, you know, state races or attorney general race or whatever, as if somehow it's a lesser entity. There may even be Bush v. Gore problems with counting one race one way and another race another way. We're not, you know, it's uncharted territory, but to equal protection issues. But basically, you know, to hand count one race is child's play. To hand count 1, 2, or 3 races is certainly doable. When you got 70 races on the ballot, even with sort and stack and color code and everything, then you do have a much harder sell as far as issues of timeliness and convenience. I think that it's very, very important, and we pointed this out in the last session, that one of the action steps for everybody here and everybody you can talk to is to make yourself available to county clerks as a hand counting staff. You know, sign pledges, and we can provide you with those, you know, templates for those pledges that say, I'm available on election day to hand count. I will commit myself to the training and stuff. And then the clerks will look at this and say, well, you know, we're not in the kind of trouble that we thought we were, where we'll never get a staff and we don't have a budget for the staff. Here are 50 volunteers in this county, or 100 volunteers who are willing to do this. That's one more reason they don't have for saying this is impossible or impractical.
Go ahead.
With the new voter ID law, which is going to take effect in November, is it November 2012 or February 2012? We are no longer allowed to vote straight tickets. And so what you were just saying about, boy, that's going to be a difficult thing to do as far as trying to, count that too.
Well, races have to be counted individually anyway, even if you vote straight tickets, because not everybody is voting straight tickets. As a matter of fact, straight ticket voting is one of the greater dangers when election rigging is concerned, so that actually might be a step in the right direction.
Okay.
Once, incidental that it might be, but hand counting, a full ballot is a challenge if there's a lot on the ballot. But if you can bifurcate the ballot and separate the federal races or separate the statewide races, I mean, those are just thoughts and ideas, but the manpower, the people power has to be there in order to really, for this to be a citizen-generated initiative that democratic participation is now going to include some of the grunt work of democracy. So not just going down, casting the vote, going home, waiting for the networks to project 2 minutes after the polls close, but actually sticking around and hand counting and participating in that civic duty kind of way, the way we do jury duty.
Sir?
Yes, we in Missouri have an organization called Voters for Election Reform. And I think we all here are very concerned about the election issue. And I think the time has come for a real strategy. I see bringing our state group together to deal with meaningful strategy. And I can see myself taking back some of these concepts that we're talking about. In Missouri, we've already had talk about, about hand-counted ballots. And again, I can see we having a state meeting coming together to deal with some of these, and maybe a few others of us from Missouri began talking about some of this real strategy. And I'm wondering now, is there a national organization that we can connect with so that we can get really serious about strategy in dealing with this momentous problem?
We're candidate.
But we're talking about doing some kind of hand-counted paper ballot Facebook cause.
Well, Facebook can't be the only place. We're all working on Facebook, and it's been kind of amazing, but also really limited. And I think there are a lot of different organizations right now. One thing I should say is that one thing I bring to this is longer history than anybody else in this issue. So I can tell you how it's developed over the past 40 years, and it's only been since 2000 that people have really, that this came into the public spotlight. A lot of groups emerged, a lot of different reform groups. Most of them were focused only on 2000 and had this idea that it sort of started there. Of course, it's gone way before that.
Yeah.
But for that reason, I think a lot of them were, the reforms that they were promoting tended to be inadequate in my mind. I mean, I'm looking for a full hand count. I'm looking for total transparency, total accountability. A lot of what was being pushed, like the Holt bill, basically called for putting getting the machines to print out a receipt for the voter. And one of the things that drove me nuts about that was that people who didn't really think it through would say, well, the machine told me I voted for Kerry, so therefore everything's fine. Well, that's not the final tally. That's just a receipt of your vote. And that made my head blow up. So that's when I started getting involved again in this and trying to say, this is worse than this is a false solve. It's going to give people a false sense of security. That's been a battle now within the election reform community for 10 years. And it's there have been the hand-counted paper ballot folks, and then more of the sort of voter-verified paper trail camp. These are the two camps. Jonathan used to be in the voter verified camp. I think he's moseyed on over to our camp now, which is nice. And I think most of us feel that what we're looking for is full transparency. What I'd like to see is more people from the existing election reform groups coming together in a more unified way. And these camps are not helpful. We're fighting amongst ourselves in it, and there's some real contention there. There are some people who are for open source software. They want to keep the computers, but they want the software to be open source. Right now it's proprietary. It's literally secret. Anybody who can read code, I can't read code, and this is why open source doesn't interest me. Because once again, I'm being told to take the results on faith, and I don't like that. But people who read code don't even think. They're in their little computer realm, and they say, well, I can see the code, and I know that there's nothing fishy in there. That's a camp in this realm, so you have to understand where the lines are drawn. But if all of us in our different camps at least can agree that we've got to get it out to the public, that we can't trust these results, that as it is now, we've got a serious problem, then we can pool our resources a lot more efficiently, maybe even find some resources for this so that we can start, getting some people paid who have been doing incredible organizing work for years, literally facing sometimes possible eviction. These people are really amazing activists. And we can maybe get a centralized website where we can form a coalition movement. Yeah. We don't have to all be one organization, but we could form a coalition movement that could reach out to others and reach out to the progressive organizations and try to get this on the top of their radar and see what comes from that. I just see the need for organization. That we're very fragmented right now.
Okay, so
Darcy, and then Mary.
Well,
Darcy
Mary
first.
and I are really together, and you mentioned this yesterday, Virginia, and I brought my computer. And if you're going to have a real strategy session, let's start
Writing things down.
Let's start writing things down.
Okay.
Let's start writing down the 5 or 6 issues. Some of the things that we can do immediately. We can all wish that the laws change. The reality is in Wisconsin, even if we could get somebody to propose knocking down that 7,500 hand count right now, it's probably not going to pass.
Mm-hmm.
So that's out in the future. But there are things that we can do right now, like getting some of the smaller, to do hand counts and things like that. So let's start identifying some of the different issues and identifying who around the state is working on them, or who can be a center point, and where we can find resources. So I'm just going to start with, let's write up here, issue, and let's write over here, resource. And so this isn't talking. This is bullet points. Let's identify for everybody what some of our issues are and what some of our resources might be as we move forward and trying in our own way to apply resources to them. Okay, Mary, why don't you go ahead and start?
with an issue.
I can start with an
Sure,
issue.
please.
You've got a lot of different. You had an uprising, we noticed, and there are a lot of people involved with that. I know Wisconsin United. Is that the group that's sort of spearheading, or they gathered
United Wisconsin.
United Wisconsin gathered a lot of signatures during that time. So somewhere there's a mailing list. Somewhere I know there are many different Wisconsin Facebook groups with a lot of membership on these different groups. I would say, right off the bat, who can coordinate among these different groups and the leadership of these groups to bring them key information. And then part of this, of course, is drafting some simple information that's really accessible. Because all of us together, we've got reams. There's incredible amounts of evidence, but we can't expect people to, slog through that right now. So we need to distill it in a way that works, and maybe in a way very specific to Wisconsin. I mean, everybody's got a different approach, but getting that information bullet pointed, and then having somebody, coordinate between the different organizations so that this issue becomes part of the agenda.
So you're talking an issue of raising public awareness that we should be alarmed.
I want to add something, not add, but build on that. I want to do face-to-face communication, what I call affinity groups, what Bonnie talked about this morning to me privately. You know, we have now in Wisconsin all the voting rights groups, the Wisconsin Citizens for Election Protection, the EI group, which is really widespread, and the Wisconsin Election Defense Alliance. And all of you people in this room, wherever you live, start meeting face-to-face. So that you're meeting in rooms like this, where there's people's houses, the people you know, and you really get to know and like and trust each other, and build up a different agendas of what you're going to do in your community. But it's not only through the internet, through Facebook and Twitter and the rest of it, which I adore. So don't misunderstand me. But the face-to-face, the building of relationships is what's crucial in any kind of uprising.
I mean, Move On used that model brilliantly. And,
House parties and all
yeah, I mean,
One of the
what they were
issues
doing.
in face-to-face communication is convincing people that there's an issue. I mean, what materials do you use, right? I mean, I have a good friend of mine from one of the grassroots groups I'm in, and it takes a lot of convincing for people to believe that this happens. So who's gonna work on the materials and the cases and
I just want to say for anybody who wasn't here before we got started last hour, we just passed around a piece of paper collecting email addresses if you're interested in gathering on a Wisconsin face-to-face basis. That's what that piece of paper is right there. And anybody else too, if you're from other states, certainly. But, you know, we live in Wisconsin. So
And we'll send it to everybody.
And then Sheila just started an additional piece of paper that's going around. So if you're getting two, that's what's going on.
And who's gonna take charge of it?
I will.
Okay.
And I'll paper. And I'll take it.
I think another you know, issue that is of sort of organizational, you know, conceptual organizational issue is how, you know, how much of a hierarchy do you need? For instance, Election Defense Alliance, my organization, we started in 2006. July 4th. I, you know, am a profoundly disabled organizer. It's not my strong suit. There were a few of us, we had a vision of building a huge, from the ground up, you know, something along the lines of ACLU or Move On or NAACP. We failed dismally. We never put in place the hierarchy, the structure, the assignment of responsibilities. We did everything basically ad hoc, and to some extent that's still the case. Part of that is because it's not necessarily easy to work with people. I mean, I find it much easier to write alone than to collaborate or have 15 people, you know, chiming in on everything. So some of it is working style, but I think that at some point, especially if you're confined within a state, a little smaller than nationally, which was the arena we were trying to work in, building a hierarchy is a pretty important idea where you actually have assignment of roles. It's hard when people are not being paid. There's a bit of a catch-22 here. When people are working as volunteers and they get a little pissed off because somebody who's their superior or their colleague or whatever has, you know, gone off on them or something, the tendency is to quit. You know, what am I doing this for? And the payment, you know, in nonprofits, good guy organizations, usually, you know, either comes from a major grant someplace or it comes somewhere down the road when you've achieved what Move On achieved, which is somehow, you know, this critical mass type of approach. And in the early stages, you just don't have it. So it requires a lot of frustration tolerance and a lot of willingness to keep doing something unpaid as if you were being paid, you know, as if this were your job and you have to keep going.
Ronnie.
Yes, I'm Ronnie Cummins. I'm National Director of Organic Consumers Association, and my job for the last 20 years has been directing national campaigns and mass media based campaigns as well. And my suggestions here are, as an outsider, I mean, Victoria and I just collaborated on an article. We were able to get it in Common Dreams and naturalnews.com and the organic consumer site. We got a lot of people just from those three to read it. So I think there is a mass audience ready for this message. However, the writing on this issue up until now, the black box voting and other stuff, is of erratic quality, you know, in terms of from an editor's standpoint. When I read your stuff, Jonathan, the other day, which was called to my attention by Victoria, my God, you know, how come I haven't seen that? So that's one point. But I think a coalition structure versus a campaign structure is really key here. And it's like a coalition around this effort at this point, in my opinion, is not possible as the primary driving point, because there's too many differences of opinion. The movement is too marginalized. People are frustrated. There's all kind of egos involved and so on. I would recommend, let's start with the people across the country who agree that hand-counted paper ballots are the solution. And let's develop a website and a communications team that can broadcast that message in a very, very powerful way. I worked with a group, Mercola.com. They have 2 million people on their email list. They're ready to promote things like this. Natural News has 1 million people on their list. I write for Natural News regularly. But they're not going to respond to a muddled strategy, and they're not going to respond to second-rate writing, okay? And so, Jonathan, I think your point, you'd rather work alone. I mean, the reason for that is you want to get something done, you know? You need a campaign where people start from the same point. And of course, you know, like I was arguing with David Cobb at this conference about, you know, how our project can work with the move to amend, you know. Then we started talking about hand-counted paper ballots, and he gave me this stuff about open source optical scanners. And I said, David, are you crazy? I said, ordinary people fall asleep when you say something like that. It's like, it's divisive for the people who are calling for hand-counted paper ballots. It's like, I'm not going to work with you until this gets worked out. This is not some minor tactic. This is the heart, you know? And you can't have a muddled message and get anywhere. Millions of people are ready to hear this. I've seen people in motion. I was an investigative reporter in 1988 in Mexico City when the elections were stolen from Cuauhtémoc Cárdenas. I saw 400 demonstrations the next day surround all the places where all the ballots were. And this happened nationwide. I mean, we're talking about a new civil rights struggle. It's going to have to get that big. And the only way it's going to get there, from my observation, is we got to get beyond amateur hour and get down to, we're setting up a campaign structure based on this solution to this problem. We're going to start communicating to millions of people what the problem is and offering the solution. In Wisconsin, there's a possibility for getting a model starting to move of what we're going to have to do in all 50 states. Mm-hmm. But I am not interested in a campaign or in a coalition where people are going to argue for the next 5 years over, whether you can trust scanners or, let's. It doesn't matter if you start with a small group of people. If you have good writers amongst them, if you have good campaign heads amongst them, because there are millions of people ready to hear this message and take action right now.
My question.
Sheila, you talked about civil disobedience before, but I think for Wisconsin that's not going to work. And so CD now in Wisconsin becomes civil duty. It's our duty to do with that which is right, even if the laws are wrong. So people in Wisconsin like to be obedient, follow laws that are just and that sort of thing. So I'm suggesting we change that to CD is now civil duty. And the other thing I was going to suggest, if we try to create too much of a hierarchy, I'm thinking back to the protests really kind of came together very organically. Everybody who saw something did something. And what I'm thinking of for this movement is actually to have kind of a Wikipedia database out there. You have every ward. You've listed all of the clerks, the election officials, the local officials, and you list the number of tasks that can be done. And those tasks could be asking the clerk to hand count, okay? He or she says no. You go to the board meeting, the council meeting, you make a presentation as to why it's important. You record that, you write letters to the editor. Anybody can pick up any of these tasks and they can go to the database and find out what has not been done in their area, and they can go and pick up and do it. Because if we have, you know, captains and lieutenants telling people what to do, that gets bogged down.
I want to say about the hierarchy, why don't we think of it more of a hub structure as opposed to a hierarchy, where, you know, you've got a center of action and determine who's in that center, and that just has to be the most dedicated people.
Sure. But we take it out to mass, it's going to require mass action.
Yeah, but so what gets generated out of that hub, and then who are the next levels? What's the next circle? You know, concentric circles of action, and that can be actually, you know, drafted, and we could do it now, you know, and determine what happens in that central hub. I mean, there is you don't want it to devolve into chaos. There's got to be some form of
And that's why I'm suggesting you have a large database out there that can be, people can see what has been done, what needs to be done. That database would also have people pledging to write in their candidates' names so that someone could go there and see, wow, 100 of the people in my district are going to do this. I'm going to do it too.
Right. Well, information hubs, you know, generating the information that's shared out to other people is important. I mean, right now, Facebook's not a hub style. It's this linear, ever-flowing thing, and you can't keep track. Like, on these Facebook pages, we have people post documents, but, you know, there's no format to it. There's no organization, so it ends up being this list of documents, and who's in the hub helping new people when they come in. Go here, read this, okay, do this. All right, how much time do you have? What are you capable of doing? We have retired people in this country who don't have to work, you know? I mean, these people can be brought into this movement, you know, and give so much more time to people with families to raise, you know? So somebody in that hub who can pull them in, give them the information, and, you know, send them back out there to share. That's what I'm talking about. So it's not so much hierarchical as it is just a basic organization to keep the wheels moving.
Does anybody else who hasn't spoken yet want to talk?
Is there any Wisconsin-oriented, Wisconsin-based websites started for this topic?
Well, there are 2 Facebook pages, 3 Facebook pages.
What are they?
They're EI, Election Integrity, Wisconsin Citizens for Election Protection.
Wait. Yeah, we'll write them out.
Oh, right, okay.
But there's an activist named Jeannie Dean.
I'm on the board.
She has a proposal to set up a more central actual website, not just a Facebook page. And she's one of the activists who's been working off her own money, you know, for a long time and really struggling with this. So, but I think she has some tech savvy people and is capable of putting this thing together. But you know, there does need to be some nominal funding for her to be able to do this. She's working many different jobs.
And let me pick up on that about the funding, because, you know, that seems so coarse in a way, and, you know, gross. I mean, money in a case like this that's so important. But, I mean, EDA has a list of fundraisers. It was public, so, you know, at one point we, through a connection, Larry David, we got the message from him that, you know, we needed $1 million, and he told an intermediary, "Oh, just tell us where to send the check." And we thought we were going to get $1 million. At this point, we had been in business for a month, and we were like, "Wow, this is good. This is good. This is easy. This is going to be easy." And it turned out it was $10,000, which is actually quite generous. You know, from anybody, and we were happy to get it, but, you know, we were a little, I think we drank the champagne a little prematurely. But, you know, since then we have a list of contributors, and every now and then we'll get a $5,000 contribution, or, you know, something like that, or a group will raise some money for us and stuff. But the vast amount of time, when we put out fundraising letters around Wisconsin to our national list, I mean, our response is, and they were well-written letters. I mean, this was, you know, they were well-written, they were well-edited, they hit all the high notes, they were scary as all get out, and the response is very, very, very minimal, if any. I think part of that is there are a bunch of reasons for that. One is that people are at different stages of awareness about this. I mean, the hammer has come down in Wisconsin, so, you know, the overreaching is what begins to make this issue relevant enough to people that they actually might consider it a funding cause. You have an actual consequence to the fact that that offices changed hands, and that consequence is that you've just lost your job, or that people that you know are being treated grossly and unfairly. That focuses people, and we don't have that everywhere, and it's spreading. It's really spreading, and it will be ripe, because this country over the next few years is going to resemble Wisconsin very, very strongly. And so there is this ripeness, but true fundraising, I mean, is a real art. And converting, you know, the fact that there's this problem, and, you know, alarming problem with elections, these consequences, this is one of the things you can do. A lot of people don't have the time, but they do have the money. And when you start getting the money coming in, then you can start hiring people like Jeannie Dean, or many Jeannie Deans, to begin working part-time or full-time to spread this message. Then it snowballs. So we've got to get to that place where we can make that flip.
There are other possible options too. There are many different ways to generate money, online in particular, through selling things. For instance, there are affiliate programs now that are very popular online, where someone who has something to sell, you sell it on your website for them, and you get a small percentage. For instance, if there was more of a coalition effort to build this campaign amongst people who are already involved, between all of us, actually, we have a lot of books. We have you know, films that have been made on this, and there are other things that can be sold through a website, and even, for instance, eBay and other online sellers have systems where people can donate a percentage of their sales of items to any given organization. If part of the campaign was to get, and this is what I mean by the coalition, I mean, we've got progressive organizations together, millions and millions of members. You know, if there were campaigns to get people to start, you know, selling things online, trade, and using all of these different sites, and all of that, you know, we're getting a percentage generated into a fund to continue to put this information out to people. It doesn't have to just be donations, is my point. There's a lot of different methods to approach this, and that just come from commerce, just come from the wheels of commerce, and people are developing this all over the internet, different models for this. There's also Kickstarter and other models for raising money. So we can talk more about that, but again, it's creating that central hub where that can be organized.
Mary, did you want to talk?
I just wanted to remind people about the exit polling, you know, that we'll be continuing to do exit polling. So if anybody's interested in that, there's a card there that you can sign.
I want you to go back to the question from Mary also about the countries. The Netherlands also, they've all been counted paper ballots, so does Israel. And on a very scary note, though, looking at Egypt, and there's a, I have a link to it in my last paper that Elections Alliance for Democracy has in their printed booklet here. Hillary Clinton has asked India to please help Egypt with their new elections. That means the United States is trying to put electronic voting machines already into Egypt to kill whatever's happening there. And there is a link in the article for her, you know, that she has already asked India to do it. Secondly, I just want to bring the word grief into this conversation of what's happening, because I not only have a lot of, you know, rage and outrage and anger and all that, I have a well of grief that is just here of what is happening in this country and in the world with the starting of, you know, the big elections. And just one last thing is that I don't think it's a good idea, and I wrote about it in 2004, I think, or 2006, and I said, let's just do the federal elections. But no, because you have Scott Walker here, and that's not, you know, the federal elections. So you're still going to be left with all this terrible stuff. It's got to be all the elections for the hand counting.
All right, well, so what's the, what website or Facebook page right now would we recommend everybody here link into initially after today?
Well, link into EDA, link into the Center for Hand Counted Paper Ballots.
They're
Link into all of those things on,
I mean, for
both of them, I
discussion.
think. Oh, for discussion.
The Facebook.
Well, what about the Wisconsin one?
Yeah, those are,
Wisconsin Election Defense Alliance.
Right.
Wisconsin Citizens for.
There is what Victoria said about the Facebook thing is, you know, I up until a few weeks ago had a Facebook page and didn't even know I had a Facebook page. I probably set it up 3 or 4 years ago and forgot all about it. And, you know, who has the time? I just don't understand. I sit in front of computers all day. But I know that what I experienced was some very interesting, fun, creative and challenging and inspiring dialogue that we went back and forth among ourselves. The small section, maybe the, you know, tenor section of the choir, going back and forth. But there were new people coming in with names I didn't recognize. And I think it kind of cuts both ways, because part of it is you do spend a hell of a lot of time stating and restating, you know, and stuff. And sometimes out of that comes the golden nugget, you know, comes the meme that just sort of develops in that incubator, and that's a good thing. On the other